So maybe real quick before we move on to our common questions we ask everyone is maybe we could talk a little bit more about the recommendations that the BPC has made to improve Congress's institution. Could you just walk us through a few of those and what you think are the highest priority?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think a number one priority for us, and I might be cheating here a little bit, but it's not a reform so much in the sense of rules or creating a new procedure or changing an old one. Um, it's really a need for a cultural change in the institution, which is that we are trying to encourage Congress to return to a culture of collaborative decision making and dialogue and deliberation, which is really absent. And without genuinely engaging in that, we think it's really difficult to imagine, a reality where Congress can really perform to the level that it needs to, because the demands on Congress have grown really greatly in the last 50 years, and especially in the last 20 years. And that has occurred at a time when Congress has gotten worse and worse at deliberating and making collective decisions. And so I think a change in the culture around regular order would be helpful. But other things have to come with that. So some of that is the relationship building that we've talked about, in terms of doing stuff like our American Congressional Exchange. But we've also encouraged, committees to do things like, set up task forces of members to address discrete issues and come up with solutions. We've encouraged a lot more collaboration, between, the staff of committees. We find that there aren't opportunities. For instance, the Senate has a mechanism called the staff del, which a lot of people have heard of, a co-del, which is sort of the trips members of Congress often take, usually abroad, but they're not sort of constantly covered by media or anything like that. These are really fact-finding and learning trips typically. But in the House, for instance, the staff don't really have that opportunity the way the Senate has specific staff delegations. So we think members could really benefit from spending time together, as well as staff, outside of their, maybe what we might think of as sort of their duty stations, or really in the way they've developed their battle stations, in Congress today. Getting outside of that and learning together is really helpful. And then, a major one that we, for a long time, have encouraged Congress, and I think Congress got very close 4 years ago on, which is, reforming our budget and appropriations process. That is something that is really crucial to a well-functioning government. I mean, it's really one of their basic responsibilities, and Congress has really not performed it well in the last 2 decades, but really has some people argue has never been very good at it. But there are real reforms that could be implemented there that we think would help, things like moving to a process of 2-year budgeting, for instance, and rather than doing year-to-year sort of planning and allocating of money, giving the government agencies more predictability, but also taking some of the workload off of Congress of having to kind of do this process over and over again, which really has resulted in, I think, for the public, probably the most obvious way is just sort of the increasing number of government shutdowns we've experienced. So there's kind of this mix, I think I want to say, of procedural reforms that are really practical things, but also cultural changes that need to happen. And one thing that we're just in the really beginning stages of starting to talk about is whether Congress just needs to think about whether the people who come there have the skills and ability to engage in deliberation, to identify and solve problems together, and whether a process could, or a culture could be created where people value that more than they value using Congress as a political tool. Because at the end of the day, Congress is still a political institution. It always has been, it always will be. But the periods where it has probably performed the best and solved the most public problems have been ones where that public interest has greatly outweighed the political ones.
Great. Well, let's move on to our common questions we ask all our guests, so that someday we can compare the answers and see the diversity that exists. Are you ready to move on?
Yeah, great.
All right. So our first one is, what do you think congressional representation should mean?
Congressional representation to me means that representatives find, I think, and this will probably vary for all members, but a balance between being a representative, but also sort of a steward and a delegate for their constituents. And I guess maybe by that I mean is that you need to find a balance between just reflecting the views of your constituents and attempting to do what you think might be in their interest, even if it's not what they think needs to be done. And that's very difficult.
Judgment by the representatives.
Absolutely. I think that, at the end of the day, members are going to have a very hard time scientifically saying, yes, this is what my constituents want overwhelmingly. It's always, I think, for members, I think they think of themselves as sort of, they're like their own really unscientific constant poll or survey, right? It's like, oh, I was in this town, they told me this, I heard this, my constituents tell me that. But, I think there are always going to be questions where members probably have more information and better judgment than their constituents do about how to solve a problem. And so I think you need to find a balance between those things.
And by constituents, you mean everybody in the district? Do you mean the voters? Do you mean the primary voters? Who do you mean? Is it everyone, or is it just a few?
That's a really good question. I think my philosophy is that, when you are elected, you represent all the people from your district or your state, not just those who vote, not just those who voted for you, not just those in your party. But, at the same time, I think you can put some weight into the fact that if you were the duly, chosen, elected representative of your district, that people put their trust in you to make decisions, and those are going to reflect, I think there's an understanding those are going to reflect your ideology and views that you communicated while you were campaigning.
And how about the future? You've got the people who are living in your district today, and then you've got the next generation, and then a few down. Does the senator represent the state in all its future, or just the current constituents, or a generation? How much do they represent?
It's a good question. When I worked for Senator Tom Udall, he often told us that his when he got elected to the Senate, his father had been a U.S. representative and a cabinet secretary. His father really impressed upon him the fact that, when you are elected, you're a United States representative, you are a United States senator, and you do have a responsibility to the whole country in the decisions that you make. So in terms of the future, I think certainly, I think that's inherent in the job of members, and probably where their judgment is needed most, because we, as humans, probably are really bad at predicting what people in the future are going to want. And so I think you as a representative have to substitute your judgment for what you think will be good for them and best for them. And so, I mostly tell people I don't envy anyone who has these jobs, because I don't want to make it sound like it's simple and clear cut that, oh, sometimes you listen to your constituents, and sometimes you listen to your gut or your heart or your brain. But you, you know, that's the job is figuring those out.
All right. Next one is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time?
I think my ideal Congress probably would allocate its time something close to maybe sort of 60% focused on um, being in Washington, solving problems, working through a deliberative process, and probably 30% of its time, back in their districts, meeting with constituents, and I think 10% of its time running for reelection, which a lot of people I know separate from sort of the idea of what someone's job is, a member of Congress, but I think we've got to accept the reality that it is a part of their job, or it has become a part of it, even if it's not ideal, but it's probably unavoidable. And to a degree that might go too far, 60, 30, 10. But I think Congress has swung too far in the other way, and there's not a lot of time spent actually legislating and making policy. But to be clear, what would need to happen for that to be viable is there need to be a change as well in the culture that people would actually want to engage in that. I'm not sure now how much members really want to do that versus wanting to be home in their districts and engaging in either direct or indirect re-election related activities, because if that's what they really want to do, then that time spent here in Washington won't be well used.
And the time in Washington, the split between legislation versus oversight, do you have an opinion on that?
I think that is always going to change depending on what the legislative and oversight needs are of the country. It's hard to pin that one down, I guess. We have periods where, I think about the 2008, 2009 time period where a lot of activity seemed to be needed, and at least was undertaken to respond to the financial crisis, a number of other things that were going on at the time. There's sort of a there's a season for all of these things. What I would say is Congress probably spends too little time doing programmatic oversight. I think there's a lot of oversight that is much more seeking of sort of attention and trying to draw out scandals and embarrass people, which is admittedly, a legitimate function of Congress. For instance, there's a scandal in the government that should be brought to light. But I think if Congress spent more time investigating how well or not well the programs it's enacted have worked, they probably could make better legislation to make those programs work. So, I think it will vary, but Congress probably could spend more time on oversight. So I guess I might put it at 50-50 if I really had to give you a number.
Right. Next one is something you've already discussed a bit, but how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress?
Yeah, structure is something at least that I'm not too worried about, because I think Congress just isn't doing deliberation. I do think there's a lot of debate that goes on. I think there's an instinct to sort of model actual kind of formal debate that you might see in debate competitions at high school and college level, which is really just sort of a trading back and forth of talking points and hoping the other side, to catch them in some kind of logical fallacy or something else. I think there's a lot of that actually goes on in Congress. There's no lack of it. But I don't think there is a lot of, genuine, attempt to understand what people who have different views from you, where they come from, what their motivations are, what their constituents' motivations are. You know, that, you know, I think a lot of assumptions are made now in Congress about what other people believe and why. And so for me, I think what Congress really would benefit from is actually a deliberation that doesn't take place like anything we know it now. And that probably is stuff that needs to happen in private conversations rather than anything that could happen in public.
All right. So the next one is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Something I haven't talked a lot about, but I think is crucial is I think Congress, the number one I would say is for years has been studying how to improve its staff recruitment, retention, development. And until recently, not a whole lot of progress has been made in that area, the studies. And I think some decisions just have to be made about how this is going to happen if the institution's really committed to it. You know, our staff can be paid more or not, and is that worth the I think they need to be, but there's a political challenge to enacting that. So that's a major one, because Congress, sort of like, you know, any service-based business, you know, let's say, or service kind of based organization, is basically as good as its people, and Congress needs to be able to attract good people, and it's really not done terrible attracting those people, but has not always done a very good job of keeping them around. So that's one major thing. I think the other one is, and this is probably going to seem a little maybe unrealistic, but I think what Congress needs is just a complete reexamination of what its systems and processes are for identifying problems and solving them. You know, sort of collective problem solving. I think you know, the systems we have in place now aren't working, and that might be because of external factors, mainly, you know, partisan polarization, election motivations, that sort of thing. But you know, we're basically, you know, I think I'll credit Modernization Committee Chairman Derek Kilmer with this, but you know, it's a 18th century, you know, institution using 19th century approaches to solve 20th century problems in the 21st century. And you know, the Congress of today would not look all that different, other than it might be it's more diverse. But in terms of its processes, than it looked 100 or 200 years ago. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I don't, you know, I think we know more now about how humans interact, how you can build consensus around things. But, you know, for the most part, we sort of just continually repeat the same processes over and over that we've been using, you know, since the Congress started.
Yeah, I was talking to Alan Schick about this issue, and he's, you know, pessimistic because of so many years of working on reform and having, he thinks, relatively little to show for it, I guess. But you know, I reminded him, and it's the same situation, is that if Congress wants to, it can totally redo its rules, right, without any constitutional amendment or even law, right? It has the power to change all of its processes, you know, in one swoop, if it wants to. So there's always going to be hope.
Yeah.
Great. Well, the next one is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I think probably a sea change for me was Francis Lee's Insecure Majorities, which really, I think, brought about a really needed understanding, both for me, but I think for a lot of people in the field, about the nature of disagreement in Congress, and why we have more disagreement in it, which has a lot to do just with the very unstable nature of majorities in Congress right now. We're seeing the majority flip back and forth between the chambers, at a rate that we haven't seen in quite some time. And that creates a really difficult set of incentives for both parties, whether you're in the majority or minority. But I think less that provided any concrete examples or reforms that needed to be enacted. I think it really brought a lot of clarity for me and for others around the nature of the problem and why it's occurring.
Well, the last question is really about your plans for the long term. What are you looking to do with Bipartisan Policy Center, and what do you have any big programs coming up or research interests that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, someone who have really stuck with this issue of democracy reform, because it's something that I'm passionate about and feels like a really pressing issue of our time, as much as things like climate change are. We are just in a really unstable time in terms of our democracy, and I think the events probably of the last year, leading up to and including, the attack on the Capitol to try to, disrupt, the counting of the Electoral College ballots. That event in and of itself was obviously very troubling and horrific, but I think for what it says about where our democracy is that we're in just a very unstable place. And so something I'm interested in, although we're not really in the phase of getting ready to start or even scope out or launch something, but I'm particularly interested sort of in this question of kind of political extremism, domestic political violence, and how that impacts our governing institutions and our political institutions, whether it's elections or Congress. I think for me, as someone who sort of splits my time between trying to make improvements in both of those areas, January 6th was a really particularly terrible day, because sort of both of those areas were really implicated in that. And it was sort of a moment for me that I think I realized there was not enough attention being paid to that issue. There are a few really great scholars and centers out there, people who look at domestic extremism, but for the most part, we, including BPC, other projects, have really been focused on foreign extremism and that threat to the country. But I think we have a real need to address some domestic ones as well.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.